Richard Richt Kessler methodically adjusted his Brioni tie in the bathroom mirror of their Chicago apartment. His reflection showed a man who had mastered the art of patience, a dangerous quality in someone plotting revenge. At 41, his face carried the composed expression of a man who had spent years calculating his next move, while others mistook his silence for weakness. The bathroom counter displayed his wife Heather's expensive cosmetics, scattered carelessly like her empty promises. Richt's eyes fixed on her wedding ring, discarded by the sink. She'd stopped wearing it 3 months ago, claiming it was too tight. He knew better now. His phone buzzed with another notification from the surveillance software he'd installed on Heather's devices. He didn't need to read it. The previous messages between her and Brian Patterson had told him everything. His MBA from Northwestern Haddon had taught him business strategy and the value of thorough intelligence gathering. "Daddy, are you going out tonight?" Tyler's voice came from the doorway. Richt turned to face his 12-year-old son, his expression softening momentarily. The boy had his father's analytical mind and his mother's dark hair. Thankfully, that's where the similarities with Heather ended. "Yes, buddy, I have an important dinner meeting. Mrs. Rodriguez will stay with you until I get back." Richt placed a firm hand on Tyler's shoulder. "Have you finished your science project?" "Almost. Mom was supposed to help, but she had another emergency meeting at work." Tyler's air quotes around the words made Richt's jaw tighten imperceptibly. "We'll work on it together tomorrow. I promise." Richt's promises, unlike Heather's, were ironclad. He'd spent the last decade building his life around Tyler's schedule, taking consulting jobs that allowed him flexibility, while Heather pursued her executive ambitions at Avalon Technologies. In his home office, Richt opened his laptop and reviewed the dossier one final time. The surveillance had been comprehensive. GPS locations, credit card statements, hotel receipts, and text messages. Brian Patterson, Heather's 32-year-old marketing director, had been careless. Their mockery of Richt and private messages made his blood run cold. "He's such a pathetic house husband," Heather had written. "All that education wasted on being a glorified babysitter. Thank God, I found a real man." Brian's response had been equally contemptuous. "He probably thinks he's being noble, supporting your career. Can't wait till we don't have to hide anymore, baby." Richt's fingers moved across the keyboard with surgical precision as he drafted 2 messages. The first one to Heather. "Meet me at Carlton's. 9 p.m. We need to talk." Simple. Direct. A command disguised as a request. The second message required more finesse. Lucas Wright, his college roommate turned Avalon Technologies board member, had been Richt's silent partner for months. "Everything's in position. Commence Phase 1. Lucas's response was immediate. "Madeline's on board. She's bringing the documentation." Richt stood and walked to his closet, selecting a bespoke Tom Ford suit he'd never worn before. Tonight deserved something special. As he dressed, he reviewed the mental checklist he'd been compiling since the first suspicious text message 3 months ago. The corporate takeover strategy was already in motion. Catherine Olson, Avalon's aging founder, had taken a particular liking to Richt during his consulting projects. She'd seen in him something Heather never had, a strategic mind that prioritized long-term success over quick wins. While Heather climbed the corporate ladder through office politics, Richt had been quietly building relationships with the people who actually controlled the company. His phone chimed with a message from Detective Andrea Martinez. Additional surveillance photos from the Grand Millennium Hotel uploaded to secure server. Timestamps match expense reports. "Excellent work," Richt replied. "Transfer the final payment as discussed." A soft knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Rodriguez, their longtime housekeeper, stood with concern etched on her face. "Mr. Kessler, Tyler asked me to give you this." She handed him a folded piece of paper, Tyler's school calendar. His science fair was marked for next week, with "Mom promised to come" written in hopeful pencil marks. Richt's expression remained neutral, but his resolve hardened further. "Thank you, Maria. Please make sure Tyler does his homework before any TV tonight. As Mrs. Rodriguez left, Rick opened his safe and retrieved a USB drive containing months of financial records. Heather's creative expense reports would make excellent ammunition for both the divorce proceedings and the corporate restructuring. He checked his watch, 8:30 p.m. time to set the trap. He sent a text to the Carlton's matriarch, Michelle, who owed him a favor after Rick had helped his daughter secure a scholarship. Table for 5. Private alcove. Usual arrangements. Rick walked into Tyler's room, where his son was bent over his science project, a detailed model of renewable energy systems. I'm heading out now, buddy. Don't stay up too late. Tyler looked up, his young face serious. Dad, are you and Mom getting divorced? Rick sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining eye contact. What makes you ask that? I'm not stupid. I heard her on the phone with someone named Brian. She was laughing about you. Tyler's hands clenched into fists. She said you were holding her back. Rick placed a steady hand on Tyler's shoulder. Whatever happens, you're my priority. Always have been. Always will be. Will we have to move? No, this is our home. Some things will change, but not that. Rick stood, straightening his jacket. Focus on your project. We'll talk more tomorrow. In the kitchen, Rick left detailed instructions for Mrs. Rodriguez and a generous bonus check. She'd been loyal for years, and loyalty was something he valued above all else. He gathered the final pieces of evidence into his briefcase. Bank statements, hotel receipts, and surveillance photos. Each document was a bullet in the gun he'd been quietly loading. The night air was cool as Rick stepped into his Mercedes S-Class. He'd bought it used 3 years ago, letting Heather believe it was all he could afford on his consulting income. The truth about his financial standing, like many things, would soon come to light. His phone buzzed with a message from Lucas. Madeleine's got the shareholder proxies. Catherine's lawyer confirmed the trust documentation is ironclad. Rick allowed himself a small smile as he drove toward Carlton's. Heather had always underestimated him, mistaking his strategic patience for weakness. She'd laughed when he'd settled for consulting work, never questioning why a Northwestern MBA would choose smaller clients over prestigious firms. She dismissed his friendship with Lucas as nostalgic college ties, never suspecting they were orchestrating her downfall. The restaurant's valet recognized him, nodding respectfully. Inside, Michelle greeted him with practiced discretion, leading him to the private alcove where Lucas Wright and Madeleine Torres were already seated. Madeleine, everything in place? Lucas asked as Rick sat down. Rick loosened his ties slightly. Detective Martinez's final report arrived today. The financial documentation is complete. Madeleine raised an eyebrow. You're sure you want to do it this way? Could be cleaner to just serve her divorce papers privately. Heather thrives on public perception. Rick replied coldly. She needs to understand exactly what she's losing and who she's lost it to. Tonight isn't just about ending a marriage, it's about launching a takeover. The matriarch D appeared at Rick's elbow. Sir, Mrs. Kessler has arrived with a companion. Rick nodded, his expression unchanging. Show them in. And Michelle, make sure the security staff is ready. The pieces were in place. The trap was set. Rick straightened his tie and prepared to convert 10 years of calculated patience into devastating action. Heather had mistaken his silence for weakness, his planning for passivity. By midnight, she would understand exactly who she had betrayed. The click of Heather's designer heels announced her arrival before she appeared in the private dining alcove. At 38, she carried herself with the confident arrogance of someone who believed they were untouchable. Her Valentino dress, charged to her Avalon expense account, Rick noted mentally, was carefully chosen to command attention. Brian Patterson trailed behind her, his eagerness evident in every movement, like an overexcited lapdog at his master's heels. The moment Heather spotted Lucas Wright and Madeleine Torres at the table, her step faltered. Brian nearly collided with her, his hand automatically reaching for her waist before he caught himself. Rick watched the micro-expression of panic cross Heather's face before she masked it with practiced corporate confidence. Lucas, Madeline, Heather recovered quickly, her voice professionally pleasant. I wasn't expecting a business dinner. Rick, you should have mentioned we'd have company. Rick gestured to the empty chairs. Sit down, Heather. You too, Brian. Since you're so integral to this discussion. Brian's youthful face flushed. Mrs. Kessler, perhaps I should. Sit. Rick's command cut through Brian's hesitation like a blade. You've been quite comfortable in your role so far. No need to play coy now. Heather's eyes narrowed as she took her seat, her spine rigid. If you have something to say, Rick, say it. Some of us have actual work to attend to. Actual work, Rick repeated softly, opening his briefcase. Like your 3-day marketing strategy session at the Grand Millennium Hotel last month. He placed several photographs on the table. Room service for 2, charged to your corporate card. Interesting choice of venue, considering Avalon has a preferred rate at the Marriott. Brian's face went from red to white. Heather's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, but her voice remained steady. If you're implying something inappropriate, I'm not implying anything, Rick interrupted, laying out more documents. I'm stating facts. Facts supported by GPS data, credit card statements, and some very explicit text messages that the board might find interesting, particularly the ones where you mock my pathetic career choices while embezzling company funds to finance your affair. Madeline Torres leaned forward, her interest purely professional. Mrs. Kessler, as a major shareholder, I'm particularly concerned about the financial implications. Care to explain these expense reports? Heather's composure cracked. You had me followed. You spied on me. She turned to Lucas. And you're part of this. After everything I've done for Avalon. Everything you've done for Avalon. Lucas's laugh was cold. You mean like sidelining our best engineers to promote your boyfriend here? Or perhaps you're referring to the creative accounting that's been hiding your personal expenses. Brian finally found his voice. This is harassment. I'll file a complaint with HR. HR reports to the board. Madeline cut in smoothly. And as of this morning, the board has some serious questions about your qualifications and hiring process. Rick watched the realization dawn in Heather's eyes. This wasn't just about their marriage. This was about her carefully constructed professional facade crumbling under the weight of her own hubris. You pathetic loser, Heather spat at Rick. Her carefully maintained poise shattered completely. You think this little ambush changes anything? I built my career while you played house husband. You're an embarrassment. I can't stand to look at you anymore. Brian is twice the man you'll ever be. Rick's expression remained unchanged as he placed a final envelope on the table. Your definition of manhood seems limited to your bedroom activities, which according to the hotel surveillance are as unimpressive as your management skills. Brian stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You can't talk to her like that. Sit down, Mr. Patterson. Madeline's voice carried the weight of institutional authority. Unless you prefer to discuss your creative accounting methods with the SEC. Rick opened the envelope, spreading out its contents. Divorce papers, Heather already filed with the court. You'll find them quite comprehensive, including evidence of your infidelity and financial misconduct. My resignation from Wilson Consulting is there as well. I no longer need to maintain that particular cover. Cover, Heather's voice faltered. What are you talking about? Lucas smiled thinly. Rick's consulting work gave him access to Avalon's vulnerabilities. Very thorough access. Catherine Olson was particularly impressed with his insights. The color drained from Heather's face at the mention of Avalon's founder. Catherine, what does she have to do with this? Everything. Rick stated simply. She's been quite concerned about the company's direction under current leadership. The board meeting next week should be interesting. Heather's laugh held a note of hysteria. You think you can threaten me? I'm the one who made something of myself while you played martyr, supporting my career. I'm the one with power here. Power. Rick's voice remained calm. You confused visibility with control, Heather. Real power is quiet. It's in the relationships you build, the loyalty you earn, the patience to wait for the perfect moment to strike. He stood, buttoning his jacket. You'll receive official notice of the emergency board meeting tomorrow. I suggest you review your employment contract, particularly the moral conduct clauses. Brian reached for Heather's arm. We should call our lawyers. Our lawyers. Rick's laugh was genuine. Mr. Patterson, I don't think you understand. You're not a team anymore. In fact, he checked his watch. As of 6 o'clock this evening, you're not even an employee of Avalon Technologies. The termination paperwork has already been processed. Heather stood suddenly, her chair toppling backward. You'll regret this, Rick. I'll destroy you. I'll take everything. You'll take nothing. Rick cut her off. The prenuptial agreement you insisted on works both ways, Heather. Infidelity clauses are particularly strict. As for destroying me, he smiled. For the first time, Heather saw something dangerous in his eyes. You had 10 years to figure out who I really am. Your failure to do so is about to become very expensive. Michelle appeared at Rick's side with impeccable timing. Sir, your car is ready, and security is available if needed. That won't be necessary, Rick replied, gathering his documents. Mrs. Kessler was just leaving, though she might want to check her corporate credit cards first. I believe there may be some authorization issues. Heather fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she opened her banking app. The color drained from her face. What did you do? The board has initiated a spending freeze, pending a financial audit, Madeline explained professionally. Standard procedure when investigating potential misconduct. Rick walked to the door, then paused. One more thing, Heather. Tyler knows. He overheard you laughing about his pathetic father on the phone. Remember that when you're explaining to the custody evaluator why you missed his last 3 school events for emergency meetings with Brian. Heather's face crumpled, the full impact of her actions finally hitting her. Rick, wait. Goodbye, Heather. Brian. Rick nodded to Lucas and Madeline. The car will take you to the office. We have work to do. As Rick walked out of Carlton's, he heard Heather's voice rising in panic, demanding answers from Lucas and Madeline. But he didn't look back. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a message from Catherine Olson. Everything proceeding as planned. Yes. He typed back. The board meeting is scheduled. Time to clean house. The valet brought his Mercedes around, and Rick slipped behind the wheel. The night wasn't over. There were documents to review, strategies to finalize. But the first phase was complete. Heather had finally seen behind his carefully constructed facade, but far too late to save herself. Catherine Olson sat in her penthouse office, reviewing the documents Rick had prepared. At 72, she'd built Avalon Technologies from nothing. And she'd be damned if she'd watch it crumble under Heather Kessler's leadership. The night skyline of Chicago stretched before her as she examined each page with meticulous attention. The shareholders are aligned, she asked, not looking up from the papers. Rick stood by the window, his reflection barely visible in the glass. Lucas and Madeline have secured the support we need. The institutional investors are concerned about the recent accounting irregularities. Catherine smiled, the expression making her look years younger. You've been playing this game for years, haven't you, Rick? All those consulting projects, building relationships, earning trust, while everyone underestimated you. People see what they expect to see. Rick replied, turning to face her. Heather saw a supportive husband who'd sacrificed his ambitions for her career. The board saw a diligent consultant who understood their concerns. No one questioned why a Northwestern MBA would choose smaller clients over prestigious firms. Detective Andrea Martinez chose that moment to enter, carrying a thick folder. The final surveillance report, Mr. Kessler, including the offshore account transfers Mr. Patterson tried to hide. Catherine raised an eyebrow. Brian's been stealing. Creative accounting, Andrea explained, laying out financial documents. He's been skimming from the marketing budget, hiding it through inflated vendor contracts. Mrs. Kessler signed off on all of it, either deliberately or through negligence. Rick examined the documents. How much? Nearly $2 million over the past 18 months, Andrea replied. I've traced it through shell companies in the Caymans. He wasn't as clever as he thought. Catherine's face hardened. The company I built. They treated it like their personal piggy bank. They'll pay for that, Rick assured her. The SEC will be very interested in these transactions. But first, we need to secure the company's future. Catherine nodded, reaching for a leather portfolio on her desk. That's why you're here tonight. My lawyers have finished the paperwork for the voting trust. Rick sat across from her as she opened the portfolio. Inside was a document he'd spent months helping to craft, though only Catherine's lawyers knew of his involvement. 30% of Avalon's voting shares, Catherine explained, though Rick knew the numbers by heart. Transferred to a trust with you as trustee. The arrangement is bulletproof. My lawyers made sure of that. Heather will challenge it, Rick noted. Catherine's laugh was sharp. Let her try. The succession plan is clear. The trust documentation is impeccable, and the SEC filings are already in process. More importantly, she fixed Rick with a stern look. I trust you to protect what I've built. Andrea laid out more surveillance photos. Mrs. Kessler has been calling board members all evening. No one's taking her calls. They're waiting to see which way the wind blows, Rick observed. Tomorrow's board meeting will settle that question. Catherine signed the trust documents with a steady hand. Tell me something, Rick. When did you first start planning this? The day Heather suggested I take consulting work to be more available for Tyler, Rick replied. She thought she was relegating me to a convenient backup role. Instead, she gave me access to every aspect of Avalon's operations, and you used that access well. Catherine noted, impressed. The shareholders trust you because you've actually listened to their concerns. The employees respect you because you've shown interest in their work. While Heather was playing office politics, you were building real relationships. Detective Martinez gathered her files. I'll have my team monitor Mrs. Kessler's movements. Mr. Patterson's too. They might try something desperate. Let them. Rick's voice was cold. Every move they make now only strengthens our position. After Andrea left, Catherine poured 2 glasses of scotch to think. Heather never realized who she was married to. 10 years, Rick. 10 years of watching, waiting, building your network while she thought you were just, what did she call you? A pathetic house husband. Rick took the offered glass. She'll understand her mistakes soon enough. The board meeting tomorrow will be interesting. Catherine mused. Lucas tells me the institutional investors are particularly concerned about the marketing department's expenditures. They should be. Rick placed a USB drive on her desk. That contains every irregular transaction Brian and Heather have authorized over the past 2 years. The audit committee will find it fascinating reading. Catherine studied him over her glass. You know, when you first started consulting for us, I thought you were wasting your potential. An MBA from Northwestern doing piecemeal projects. But you saw something I didn't you? I saw an opportunity, Rick confirmed. Every project gave me deeper insight into Avalon's operations. Every relationship I built was another piece on the board. Heather thought she was the chess master, but she was just moving pieces around randomly. And now the game is over. She just doesn't know it yet. Rick stood, straightening his jacket. The trust documents will be registered first thing tomorrow. By noon, the board will convene. By close of business, Avalon will have new leadership. Catherine walked him to the door. You're a dangerous man, Rick Kessler. Patient, methodical, ruthless when necessary. Exactly what Avalon needs. I learned from the best. Rick smiled slightly. You built this company by outthinking your opponents, not outspending them. Tomorrow, we'll save what you built. As Rick drove home, his phone buzzed with updates. Lucas confirming the board meeting logistics. Madeline reporting that institutional investors were backing their play. Detective Martinez noting that Heather had checked into the Four Seasons. Apparently, Her corporate cards weren't all frozen yet. In his apartment, Tyler was asleep on the couch, his science project materials spread across the coffee table. Mrs. Rodriguez had left a note. Tyler had refused to go to bed until he finished the renewable energy model. Rick carried his son to bed, something he hadn't done in years. Tomorrow would bring chaos and corporate warfare, but tonight, he was simply a father protecting his child's future. As he closed Tyler's door, his phone lit up with a message from Heather. "We need to talk. Please, I can explain everything." Rick deleted the message without responding. The time for talks had passed. Tomorrow would bring consequences, and Heather would finally understand exactly who she had betrayed. The silent moves were over. Now it was time for action. 3 months after the confrontation at Carlton's, Rick Kessler stood in his newly acquired penthouse apartment, surveying the Chicago skyline through reinforced glass. The property had been purchased through Alexandria Holdings, LLC, one of several shell companies he'd established years ago. His phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer, Patricia Blackwood. Custody hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Evidence packages prepared. Child psychologist Dr. Sarah Chun confirmed for expert testimony. Rick typed a brief acknowledgement. The custody battle had become Heather's last desperate attempt to maintain control, but like everything else, she'd underestimated his preparation. "Mr. Kessler." Michael Foster's voice interrupted his thoughts. The former Navy SEAL turned personal trainer stood in the doorway of the penthouse's private gym. "Ready for your session?" Rick nodded, already changed into workout gear. Over the past 12 weeks, Foster had transformed their training sessions into a brutal test of will. "Your form's improving," Foster noted as Rick completed a complex series of exercises. "The strength gains are significant." Most clients would have quit by week 2. "I'm not most clients," Rick replied between controlled breaths. "How long until we reach the target metrics?" Foster checked his tablet. "At this rate, another 6 weeks. Though I have to ask, why the emphasis on functional strength over aesthetics?" Foster responded, "Most executives just want to look good in a suit." "Looking good in a suit is Rachel's department," Rick said, referencing his image consultant. "I need to be stronger than anyone expects." The session continued for another hour. Each movement was precisely calibrated. As Rick completed the final set, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Vincent Maxwell. "Conference room in an hour." The message read, "Bringing the Avalon financials." Rick showered and dressed in one of the new suits Rachel Hammond had selected. The image consultant had systematically replaced his wardrobe. Each piece was chosen to project authority without ostentation. "The goal isn't to look different," Rachel had explained during their first consultation. "It's to look like you've stepped into who you always were." In the penthouse's study, Rick reviewed the custody battle preparation. Dr. Chin's psychological evaluation of Tyler was comprehensive, detailing Heather's absences, the impact of her affair on Tyler's emotional well-being, and Rick's consistent presence in his son's life. "Dad." Tyler's voice came from the study door. He'd adapted well to the penthouse. His new room was filled with the science equipment Rick had encouraged him to explore. "Can I ask you something?" Tyler asked. "Always." Mom called again. She was crying, saying she's sorry that she wants to come home. Tyler's voice held more confusion than distress. "She said you're being cruel, keeping me from her." Rick turned to face his son fully. "Do you feel kept from her?" "No. She's the one who kept missing everything. My science fair, parent-teacher conferences, even my birthday dinner." Tyler's expression hardened in a way that reminded Rick of himself. "I heard what she said about you, in those messages with Brian. She's the cruel one." "The custody hearing is tomorrow," Rick explained. "Whatever happens, it's about ensuring your stability. Your mother made her choices. I want to stay with you," Tyler said firmly. "I told Dr. Chun that. Mom only remembers I exist when it helps her look good." A knock at the door interrupted them. Vincent Maxwell entered, carrying a thick portfolio. At 65, Maxwell had orchestrated some of the most aggressive corporate takeovers in recent history. "Tyler, why don't you work on your robotic project?" Rick suggested. "We'll have dinner after my meeting." Once Tyler left, Maxwell spread documents across the desk. Avalon's financial structure is more vulnerable than it appears. Heather's leadership team has been creative with the numbers, but not creative enough. "Show me," Rick demanded. For the next 2 hours, Maxwell walked Rick through the intricacies of hostile takeovers. Every potential defense mechanism, every regulatory requirement, every shareholder pressure point was methodically analyzed. "Catherine Olson's voting trust is key," Maxwell explained. "With her 30% stake under your control, combined with Lucas and Madeleine's holdings, we can force a board vote. But timing is crucial. The trust documentation is already filed with the SEC," Rick noted. "Heather's team will be looking for ways to challenge it." Maxwell smiled grimly. "Let them try. Catherine's lawyers made it bulletproof. The real question is, are you ready for what comes next? Taking control is one thing. Holding it requires a different kind of ruthlessness." "I spent 10 years being underestimated," Rick replied. "That ends now." Their discussion was interrupted by another message, this one from Detective Martinez. The surveillance photos showed Heather leaving her lawyer's office, her expression desperate. Attached were recordings of her recent phone calls, trying to rally support among Avalon's executives. "She's getting sloppy," Martinez noted in her message, "making threats, trying to buy loyalty with promises she can't keep." Rick forwarded the evidence to Patricia Blackwood for the custody hearing. Every desperate move Heather made only strengthened his position. The next morning, Rick arrived at the courthouse early. Tyler sat beside him in the gallery, both dressed in suits that Rachel had selected for maximum impact. Successful father, well-adjusted son. Heather arrived late. Her designer outfit was carefully chosen to project maternal concern. Her lawyer, James Morrison, immediately tried to paint Rick as controlling and vindictive. "Your Honor," Morrison began, "Mr. Kessler has systematically alienated my client from her son, using his financial resources to objection." Patricia Blackwood interrupted. "Counsel is attempting to prejudice the court without evidence. We have documented proof of Mrs. Kessler's systematic neglect of her parental duties." The judge, Eleanor Martinez, no relation to the detective, reviewed the evidence packages. Rick watched as she examined the calendar entries, the missed events, the text messages mocking her family obligations. Dr. Chin's testimony was particularly damaging. "In my professional opinion, Tyler shows signs of emotional withdrawal, specifically related to his mother's pattern of choosing professional and personal engagements over parental responsibilities. In contrast, his relationship with his father demonstrates secure attachment and healthy emotional development." Heather's facade cracked when Tyler testified. "Mom says she loves me, but she's never there. She missed my science fair to be with Brian. She forgot my birthday because of a business dinner. Dad's the one who's always been there." "You ungrateful little..." Heather started to rise, but Morrison yanked her back down. The judge's decision was decisive. Based on the evidence presented, including the child's clear preference and the documented pattern of maternal neglect, primary custody is awarded to the father. Mrs. Kessler will have supervised visitation rights to be reviewed in 6 months, pending demonstrated improvement in her commitment to parental responsibilities. Outside the courtroom, Heather tried one last time. "Rick, please. You can't do this. He's my son too. He was your son every day for the past 12 years. Rick replied calmly, "You just didn't care until you started losing everything else." "Tyler," he turned to his son, "wait for me by the car with Frank." Once Tyler was out of your sight, Rick's voice turned cold. "You questioned my manhood, mocked my sacrifices, betrayed everything I built for our family. Now you'll understand exactly what you threw away. Is this what it's all about?" Heather's laugh was brittle. "Your bruised male ego." "No, Heather. This is about consequences. The custody hearing was just the beginning. Board meetings next week. I suggest you update your resume." As Heather's face paled with realization, Rick walked away. In the car, Tyler was already immersed in a book about robotics. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The morning of the emergency board meeting bloomed clear and crisp. Rick adjusted his tie in the mirror of his private bathroom at the penthouse. The Brion suit was new. Another of Rachel Hammond's selections cut to emphasize the physical changes wrought by months of training with Foster. His phone lit up with a series of coordinated messages. Lucas, right. Institutional investors confirmed. Proxy votes secured. Madeline Torres. Asian markets closing strong. Timing works in our favor. Patricia Blackwood. SEC filings complete. Trust documentation ironclad. Detective Martinez. Subject H attempting last-minute calls to board members. No responses. Catherine Olson. Make it quick. Make it clean. Make it legal. Show them what real leadership looks like. The Avalon Technologies boardroom occupied the top floor of their downtown headquarters. Rick had deliberately arrived early, reviewing his presentation materials with Lucas and Madeline, while other board members filtered in. Nervous? Lucas asked quietly. Rick's smile was razor-thin. You've known me since Northwestern. When have you ever seen me nervous? Fair point. Though I have seen you patient. 10 years of patience pays off today. The boardroom filled steadily. Rick noted each arrival, each whispered conversation. The institutional investors' representatives clustered together, their concern evident in their furtive glances at their phones. Avalon stock had been volatile since rumors of financial irregularities began circulating. Heather arrived last. Brian was conspicuously absent. Her attempt at confident swagger was undermined by the shadows under her eyes. The custody battle loss had hit her hard, but Rick felt no sympathy. She'd chosen her path. Before we begin, Heather started, standing at the head of the table. I want to address the malicious rumors. Point of order. Madeline interrupted smoothly. As the representative of major shareholders, I moved to modify the agenda. We have serious concerns about recent financial disclosures that require immediate attention. I second the motion, Lucas added formally. The corporate secretary, Janet Chin, spoke up. The motion requires a simple majority to, called for a vote. One of the institutional investors interrupted. The irregularities and the latest SEC filings need to be addressed. Rick watched Heather's composure crack slightly. She hadn't expected resistance so quickly. Very well, she managed. But first, I'd like to present our quarterly earnings. Those earnings are exactly what we need to discuss. Rick spoke for the first time, his voice carrying easily across the room. He stood, distributing thick folders to each board member. Specifically, the creative accounting used to achieve them. Heather's face went white. You have no authority to. Actually, he does. Catherine Olson's lawyer, Michael Chong, interrupted. As trustee of Ms. Olson's voting shares, Mr. Kessler has both the authority and the responsibility to address governance concerns. The room erupted in whispers. Heather stared at Rick, finally understanding the depth of her miscalculation. If you'll turn to page 3, Rick continued calmly, you'll find detailed documentation of systematic accounting irregularities in the marketing department, specifically inflated vendor contracts used to disguise personal expenses and unauthorized fund transfers. These are baseless accusations, Heather snapped, but her voice shook. The SEC doesn't think so, Madeline added. Their preliminary investigation has already flagged several transactions for review. Rick clicked a remote, bringing up financial charts on the boardroom screens. Over the past 18 months, approximately $2 million has been misappropriated through a series of shell companies. The transactions were approved by our current CEO, either through gross negligence or deliberate complicity. This is ridiculous, Heather tried to rally. I've led this company to record profits. Artificial profits, Lucas cut in, achieved through accounting manipulation and at the expense of long-term stability. The institutional investors are particularly concerned about the impact on share value. Once these irregularities become public, Rick moved to the head of the table, forcing Heather to step aside. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in current leadership to be followed by the appointment of an interim CEO and a full external audit. Seconded, came multiple voices. This is a coup. Heather's voice rose. You can't. Mrs. Kessler, Michael Chong interrupted again. Perhaps you should consult with legal counsel before making any further statements that might be construed as admissions. The vote was decisive. One by one, board members raised their hands, many unable to meet Heather's increasingly desperate gaze. The institutional investors, protecting their funds' interests, voted as a block. Motion carries, Janet Chin announced formally. Vote of no confidence passes with 78% in favor. Now, Rick's voice remained calm. I move to appoint an interim CEO to oversee the transition and audit process. Madeleine stood. I nominate Richard Kessler. His consulting work has given him deep insight into Avalon's operations, and his track record of strategic planning is exactly what we need during this critical period. You planned this. Heather's voice was barely a whisper. All of it, the consulting work, the relationships with the board, Catherine's trust. I learned from you, Heather, Rick replied quietly. You taught me that power isn't about titles or corner offices. It's about knowing people's weaknesses, their desires, their price. The only difference is, I built something real while you played it being important. The vote for interim CEO was even more decisive. Rick accepted with practiced humility, outlining his 100-day plan for stabilizing the company and restoring shareholder confidence. Security will escort you out, he informed Heather when the meeting concluded. Your credentials have been deactivated. HR will contact you regarding the termination package. You can't do this to me. She tried one last time. I built this company. No, Catherine built this company. You just borrowed her achievement. Rick turned to the head of security. Please ensure Mrs. Kessler leaves the premises and check her bags. We don't want any sensitive documents leaving with her. As Heather was led away, the board members gathered around Rick, offering congratulations and support. Lucas hung back, an amused smile playing at his lips. Enjoying the show? Rick asked quietly. 10 years of patience paid off in 2 hours. Lucas mused. You know she'll try to fight back. Let her try. Every move she makes now only proves why she needed to be removed. Rick checked his phone. A message from Tyler's school confirmed his son had aced his science exam. Now shall we begin the real work of saving this company. Over the next 6 months, Rick Kessler transformed Avalon Technologies with surgical precision. His first act as CEO was to commission a thorough external audit conducted by one of the Big Four accounting firms. The results confirmed everything he had presented to the board and uncovered even more financial irregularities under Heather's leadership. The transformation began in the executive suite, Rick's office. Once Heather's domain of expensive art and designer furniture was converted into a command center. Multiple screens tracked global operations, market data, and project timelines. The comfortable couch where she'd held court was replaced by a conference table where Rick held daily strategy sessions with his new leadership team. The SEC filing is ready for your review, Patricia Blackwood announced, entering with another stack of documents. As both his divorce lawyer and now Avalon's chief legal officer, she'd been instrumental in navigating the complex regulatory requirements of the transition. Rick examined the papers carefully. Every move had to be legally bulletproof. Heather's attempts to challenge her termination had already been filed. The regulatory approvals came through this morning. The board's decision is fully supported by the evidence of financial misconduct. Her lawsuit doesn't have legs, and Brian's position, Patricia continued, terminated for cause based on the audit findings. He's been quietly reaching out to headhunters, but our documentation of his creative accounting has made him toxic in the industry. Rick signed the SEC documents with a Montblanc pen, a gift from Catherine Olson years ago. Any other fires to extinguish? Heather tried to access the building again yesterday. Security turned her away. She's been calling board members, trying to rally support, but no one's taking her calls. Patricia's smile was sharp. Amazing how quickly loyalty evaporates when people realize they've backed the wrong horse. The intercom buzzed. His new executive assistant, Sarah Chun, efficient and unflappable, said, "Mr. Kessler, the development team is ready for the product review." Rick gathered his materials and headed to the conference room. The development team had been one of Avalon's strongest assets, consistently undermined by Heather's focus on marketing over innovation. Today, they would present their latest projects without fear of their budgets being redirected to fund executive retreats. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rick addressed the room, "show me what you've been working on." For the next 2 hours, he watched his engineers and developers present breakthrough technologies that had been shelved under previous leadership. Each presentation reinforced his conviction that Avalon's true strength lay in innovation, not office politics. "These are impressive," he commented after the final presentation. "I want implementation plans on my desk by next week. Budget won't be an issue." The team's surprise was palpable. Under Heather, they'd grown accustomed to fighting for every dollar. Rick's direct approach and clear support for innovation was transforming company morale. Back in his office, he reviewed the latest shareholder reports. The stock price had stabilized after initial volatility, strengthened by transparent financial reporting and clear strategic direction. The institutional investors who'd backed his takeover were seeing their faith rewarded. "Mr. Kessler," Sarah interrupted via intercom, "Detective Martinez is here with her final report." Andrea Martinez entered, carrying a thick folder. "The surveillance operation is complete. Every attempt by Mrs. Kessler to undermine your position has been documented and neutralized." Rick reviewed the report. Heather had been busy attempting to leak sensitive information to competitors, trying to poach key employees, even approaching journalists with allegations of corporate misconduct. Each attempt had been anticipated and countered before it could gain traction. "She's getting desperate," Andrea noted, running out of options and allies. "Maintain the surveillance," Rick instructed. "She'll make a mistake eventually. When she does, I want it documented." The detective nodded and left. Rick turned to his computer, reviewing the latest company metrics. Employee satisfaction scores were up 40%. Project completion rates had improved by 35%. The external audit had revealed opportunities for operational efficiency that would improve the bottom line without sacrificing innovation. His phone buzzed with a message from Tyler. "Got an A+ on my robotics project. Can I show you after dinner?" Rick smiled briefly, his first genuine expression of the day. "Absolutely. I'll be home by 7. Another message followed, this one from Lucas. "Board review meeting tomorrow. The quarterly numbers are strong. You've done the impossible." "Not impossible," Rick typed back. "Just required patience and the right motivation." He spent the remainder of the afternoon in back-to-back meetings, methodically rebuilding Avalon's corporate structure. Each decision was calculated. Each change designed to strengthen the company while erasing traces of Heather's mismanagement. At 6:30, he reviewed the next day's schedule with Sarah. "The board meeting is at 9. I need the updated financial projections and the audit committee's final report." "Already on your desk, sir. Also, Mrs. Kessler tried to reach you through the main switchboard again." Rick's expression hardened. Standard protocol. No calls. No messages. No exceptions. Any communication goes through legal. "Understood. Will you be needing anything else?" "No, thank you. Good night, Sarah." As the office emptied, Rick stood at his desk, reviewing one final document, the 100-day plan he presented to the board. Each milestone had been met or exceeded. Avalon was transforming into what it should have been all along, a company driven by innovation and merit, not politics and personal ambition. His phone buzzed again, a message from Catherine Olson. "You've exceeded my expectations. The board reports are impressive. Thank you for trusting me with your legacy." Trust had nothing to do with it, came her response. I recognized in you what Heather never could. The capacity for both vision and ruthlessness. Sometimes building something great requires destroying what stands in the way. Rick gathered his things, preparing to head home. The security team's daily report noted that Heather had been denied entry to the building twice more, each time growing more agitated. Her access codes had been deactivated, her parking pass revoked, her company credit cards canceled. The systematic dismantling of her corporate life was complete. In the parking garage, he passed her empty reserve spot, now reassigned to the head of research and development. Every trace of her presence was being methodically erased, replaced by something more substantial. The drive home gave him time to reflect on the past 6 months. The transformation of Avalon had been comprehensive, financial, structural, and cultural. The fear-based management style of Heather's era had been replaced by clear metrics and merit-based advancement. Innovation was no longer sacrificed for short-term gains. His new penthouse came into view, its lights welcoming in the evening sky. Inside, Tyler would be waiting to show him the robotics project, tangible proof that focus and dedication yielded results. The company was secure, his position unassailable, and his son was thriving. Rick allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Heather had thought she was married to a pushover, a man who'd sacrificed his ambition for her career. Instead, she'd married someone who understood that true power comes from patient planning and precise execution. Her betrayal hadn't broken him. It had simply given him permission to stop pretending. The security desk notified him that Tyler had ordered dinner from their favorite Italian restaurant. Family dinner, then robotics project review, a normal evening in their new life. Tomorrow would bring another board meeting, another step in Avalon's transformation, another day of building something stronger on the ruins of Heather's ambitions. Rick smiled as he rode the elevator to his penthouse. Everything had proceeded exactly as planned. The company was his, the future was secure, and his enemies had been reduced to watching helplessly from the sidelines. Revenge, he had discovered, was not about emotional outbursts or dramatic confrontations. It was about methodically dismantling everything your opponent held dear while building something greater from the wreckage. The divorce proceedings took place in the same courthouse where Rick had won custody of Tyler. Patricia Blackwood, now both Avalon's chief legal officer and Rick's divorce attorney, had prepared meticulously for this final dismantling of Heather's life. All rise, the bailiff announced as Judge Marcus Reynolds entered the courtroom. Heather sat with James Morrison, her third attorney in as many months. The first two had withdrawn after discovering the extent of her financial deceptions. Your Honor, Patricia began, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone holding a royal flush. We're prepared to present evidence of Mrs. Kessler's systematic financial misconduct, including documentation of hidden accounts and misappropriated corporate funds. Morrison attempted to object. Your Honor, my client's corporate conduct has no bearing on. It has every bearing, Patricia interrupted smoothly. These accounts were maintained during the marriage and funded through activities that breach both corporate and criminal law. The funds in question are subject to community property considerations. Rick watched from his position beside Patricia, his expression neutral as forensic accountant David Chun approached the witness stand. Chun had spent months unraveling Heather's financial web. Mr. Chun, Patricia began, please explain your findings regarding Mrs. Kessler's undisclosed accounts. Chun activated a presentation display. We identified 3 offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, established approximately 4 years ago. Deposits into these accounts correlate directly with irregular vendor payments from Avalon Technologies' marketing budget. Heather's face tightened as Chun methodically detailed every transaction, every hidden transfer, every attempt at concealment. Her new designer outfit, likely purchased on credit, couldn't mask her growing desperation. Furthermore, Chun continued, we found evidence of regular transfers to a private account belonging to Brian Patterson, starting shortly after his hiring at Avalon. Objection. Morrison stood. Mr. Patterson's finances are not relevant to these proceedings. Overruled. Judge Reynolds replied, "Given the documented affair and its financial implications, Mr. Patterson's accounts are pertinent." Patricia presented a new set of documents. "Your Honor, we've prepared a complete accounting of funds that should have been declared as marital assets. Mrs. Kessler's attempt to claim alimony is particularly audacious given her deliberate concealment of these resources." Heather finally broke her silence. "This is harassment." Rick's using his position to. "Mrs. Kessler," Judge Reynolds cut in sharply, "I advise you to remain silent unless directly addressed. These financial records speak for themselves." The proceedings continued with mechanical precision. Patricia presented evidence of Heather's infidelity, financial misconduct, and attempts to alienate Tyler. Each document, each testimony was another nail in the coffin of Heather's claims. During a brief recess, Morrison approached Patricia in the hallway. "We should discuss settlement terms." "There are no terms to discuss," Patricia replied. "Mr. Kessler's position is clear. Mrs. Kessler leaves with exactly what she deserves: nothing." When the court reconvened, Morrison attempted one last gambit. "Your Honor, my client is willing to consider a reasonable." If Mrs. Kessler wished to discuss reasonableness, Patricia interjected, "She should have considered that before attempting to conceal assets and make false claims against my client's character." The judge's ruling was decisive. The prenuptial agreement will be enforced, strengthened by evidence of Heather's infidelity and financial misconduct. Her attempts to claim alimony are dismissed. The hidden accounts are ordered frozen, pending criminal investigation. As the judge read his decision, Rick's phone buzzed with a message from Detective Martinez. "B. Patterson attempting to file wrongful termination suit. Evidence package ready." Rick forwarded the message to Patricia, who nodded slightly. They had anticipated this move. Brian's desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his career would only serve their purposes. After the ruling, Heather attempted to approach Rick. "You've destroyed everything I built. Are you happy now?" Rick's response was measured, his voice carrying just far enough for the nearby court reporter to hear. "You destroyed it yourself, Heather. I simply ensured you couldn't take the company down with you. I'll appeal. I'll fight this." "With what resources?" Heather demanded. Rick's smile was razor thin. "Your hidden accounts are frozen. Your credit is ruined. The SEC is investigating your role in Brian's creative accounting. Even your new lawyer is about to withdraw once he realizes you can't pay his fees." As if on cue, Morrison approached with an uncomfortable expression. "Mrs. Kessler, regarding our fee arrangement." Rick left them to their discussion, joining Patricia at the courthouse steps. Brian's lawsuit already handled. Patricia assured him, "Our countersuit is prepared. The evidence of his embezzlement is comprehensive. Once he realizes we're pursuing criminal charges, he'll run. Make sure Detective Martinez knows his likely destinations. I want him followed, already arranged. Our sources suggest he's been making inquiries about properties in Mexico." Rick checked his phone. A message from Tyler read, "How did it go?" "Justice prevailed," he typed back. "See you at dinner." Later that week, Brian's lawsuit landed on Patricia's desk. Within hours, their countersuit was filed, backed by forensic accounting reports and documented evidence of systematic embezzlement. The criminal complaints followed, carefully timed to hit just as Brian was seeking new employment. "He's booked a flight to Cancun," Detective Martinez reported. "One-way ticket purchased with cash." "Let him run," Rick reconstructed. "His flight makes our case stronger. Make sure the relevant authorities are notified after he crosses the border." Heather's attempts to reach Rick grew increasingly desperate as Brian's lawsuit imploded. Her calls went unanswered. Her emails were filtered to a special folder Patricia's team monitored for useful evidence. Each desperate attempt at contact only reinforced the justice of her isolation. The final piece fell into place when Brian's assistant, sensing the shifting winds, provided copies of emails documenting the full extent of his financial schemes. The evidence was damning. Patricia noted, not just Brian's embezzlement, but Heather's knowing compliance. Found something interesting, Patricia noted, reviewing the emails. Brian's been asking Heather for money. Apparently, his exit strategy wasn't as well funded as he thought. Rick allowed himself a small smile. Forward the relevant emails to the forensic accounting team. Let's make sure every penny is traced. The next day, Brian's lawyer withdrew from the wrongful termination suit. Within hours, Brian's phone was disconnected, his apartment cleaned out. Detective Martinez's team tracked him to the airport, documenting his flight to Mexico with meticulous detail. Heather's reaction to Brian's flight was everything Rick had anticipated. Her desperate calls to his former associates, her attempts to distance herself from his actions, her increasingly frantic efforts to salvage her own reputation. All of it documented, all of it strengthening their position. She's running out of options, Patricia observed, reviewing the latest surveillance reports. No job prospects, no financial resources, no allies left. Good, Rick replied simply. Let her understand exactly what she threw away. The final divorce decree arrived without fanfare, a simple document ending 12 years of marriage. Rick signed it without hesitation. Another piece in the systematic dismantling of Heather's world. That evening, he reviewed the latest reports from Detective Martinez. Brian had been tracked to a small coastal town in Mexico, attempting to rebuild his life under an assumed name. Heather had been reduced to selling her designer clothes online. Her credit cards maxed out. Her former social circle evaporated. Justice, Rick mused, is sometimes best served cold. The transformation of Avalon Technologies under Rick's leadership was comprehensive and ruthless. His first major decision sent shockwaves through the company. Promoting Sandra Martinez, a brilliant engineer Heather had deliberately sidelined, to Chief Technology Officer. Your proposal for the new R&D division is ambitious, Rick noted, reviewing Sandra's plans in his office. Tell me why it will work. Sandra, whose innovative designs had been buried under Heather's marketing focus regime, laid out a detailed vision. We've been playing it safe, chasing quarterly numbers instead of real breakthroughs. Give me 6 months and a proper budget. I'll show you what this team can really do. Rick signed the approval without hesitation. You have 3 months. Show me results. The changes rippled through Avalon like shockwaves. Political appointees were replaced with technical experts. Project funding followed innovation rather than internal politics. The culture shifted from presentation to performance. The engineering team's morale had increased 60% since the reorganization. Project completion rates are up. Overtime is down. And we're seeing unprecedented collaboration between departments, Sarah Chin reported during the monthly metrics review. Tyler, now thriving in the stable environment Rick had created, spent afternoons in Avalon's new youth science program, an initiative Rick had approved specifically to nurture young talent. The boy's interest in technology had blossomed, encouraged by mentors from the engineering team. Dad, look at this, Tyler exclaimed one evening, demonstrating a robot he built in the program. Sandra helped me optimize the control algorithms. Rick watched his son's excitement with satisfaction. This was what I fought for, not just corporate success, but creating an environment where innovation and merit were valued above politics and appearances. The company's transformation attracted attention. Industry publications noted Avalon's increasing patent filings, its aggressive recruitment of top technical talent, and its growing reputation for breakthrough innovations rather than marketing hype. The markets are responding, Lucas noted during a strategy session. Share price is up 40% since you took over. The institutional investors were thrilled. Madeline Torres added her perspective. More importantly, we're seeing quality in the pipeline. Real innovations, not just repackaged features with fancy marketing. Through mutual friends, Rick received occasional updates about Heather. She'd moved to a small apartment in Milwaukee, taking a middle management position at a regional firm. Her attempts to leverage her Avalon experience had failed. Rick's team had been thorough in documenting her role in the financial irregularities. She tried to reach out to some of our former clients, Detective Martinez reported. They shut her down immediately. Your documentation of her misconduct was very comprehensive, Patricia added. Brian's desperate emails to Heather, begging for money from his Mexican exile, were automatically forwarded to Rick's legal team. Each message strengthened our position, documenting the full extent of their former collaboration. Your quarterly presentation to the board is ready for review, Sarah informed Rick one morning. R&D wants to demonstrate the new prototype as well. The board meeting showcased Avalon's transformation. Sandra's team presented breakthrough technologies that had been developed in months rather than years. The financial reports showed strong growth built on innovation rather than accounting tricks. This is what Avalon should have been all along. Catherine Olson commented after the presentation, "You've exceeded my expectations." Rick. Tyler's progress matches the company's, Sarah added. His grades have improved dramatically. His interest in science and technology has been fostered by both his father's attention and Avalon's resources. The stability of his home life with Rick has erased the uncertainty of Heather's era. The school's science department requested Tyler present his robotics project at the state competition. Mrs. Rodriguez reported one evening, "He's already working on improvements." Rick's leadership style had become legendary within the industry. His decisions were swift and final, his standards uncompromising, his support for innovation absolute. Those who delivered results thrived. Those who played politics disappeared. 1 year after taking control of Avalon, Rick stood at the podium of the Chicago Business Awards, accepting the Most Innovative Company trophy. The audience included the city's entire business elite, except for one conspicuously absent former executive. Innovation isn't about marketing or management buzzwords, Rick stated in his acceptance speech. It's about creating an environment where brilliant people can do extraordinary work. Avalon's success belongs to our engineers, our developers, our visionaries who now have the freedom to push boundaries. He deliberately omitted any reference to previous leadership, but the message was clear to anyone who knew the company's history. In the audience, Sandra Martinez, now a respected industry figure, nodded in appreciation. Back at Avalon's headquarters, Catherine Olson's portrait held a place of honor in the boardroom. Beside it hung her final letter to Rick. "Sometimes the quietest ones make the best leaders. You proved me right." The celebration dinner that evening gathered the key players who'd helped transform Avalon. Tyler, now confident and academically thriving, sat between Sandra and Lucas, eagerly discussing his latest robotics project. Madeline Torres engaged in strategic planning with the R&D team. Patricia Blackwood shared quiet jokes with Detective Martinez about their former target's continuing misfortunes. "Quite a change from a year ago," Lucas noted quietly to Rick. "Remember when Heather thought she was untouchable?" Rick's response was measured. Power isn't about titles or corner offices. It's about building something lasting. The evening news played silently on a nearby screen, showing Avalon stock hitting another record high. Sarah approached with a message card, which Rick read without changing expression. "Heather," Lucas guessed, another attempt to reach out through intermediaries. Apparently, her regional management position isn't quite as satisfying as she'd hoped. Rick passed the card to Patricia for the legal team's records and turned his attention to Tyler, who was demonstrating his latest innovation to an impressed audience of engineers. The next morning, Rick arrived early at his office. The message from Heather joined hundreds of others in the legal team's evidence files. On his desk, proposals for Avalon's expansion into Asian markets awaited his review. Sarah entered with the morning briefing. The board approved the employee stock option program. HR is preparing the announcements. Good. Make sure the distribution prioritizes the technical teams. Rick signed the authorization while reviewing market reports. What else? R&D wants to schedule a review of the quantum computing project. And Tyler's school called. He won first place in the science fair. Rick allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The company is thriving. My son is flourishing. And my enemies are exactly where they deserve to be, watching helplessly from the shadows of their own mediocrity. Sometimes, he mused, reviewing the latest innovation reports, The best revenge isn't in destroying your enemies. It's in building something so magnificent, they're forced to witness their own irrelevance. The morning sun illuminated Avalon's transformed headquarters. In the labs below, Sandra's teams worked on technologies that would reshape industries. In the boardroom, Catherine's portrait watched over a company finally worthy of its founder's vision. And in his office, Rick Kessler, the man who had orchestrated it all, focused on building an even greater future. The quiet certainty of victory, he had learned, was sweeter than any dramatic gesture of revenge. He had not just won. He had transcended the very battlefield where Heather had thought herself supreme. "Sarah," he called, "schedule a review of the Asian expansion proposals. And call Tyler's school. I'll be there for his science fair presentation." Power, real power, wasn't in what you could destroy. It was in what you could build, what you could nurture, what you could transform. Rick had built something magnificent from the ashes of betrayal. And that was a revenge far sweeter than mere destruction could ever be. Epilogue. 5 years later, the Wall Street Journal's headline caught Heather Kessler's attention as she waited for her bus to downtown Milwaukee. Avalon Technologies revolutionizes quantum computing market. Stocks soared past $500. Below the headline was a photo of Rick Kessler, now 56, accepting another innovation award. Heather's hands trembled as she folded the newspaper into her worn handbag. Her regional management position at Midwest Data Solutions had ended 2 years ago. Budget cuts, they'd said, but she knew her reputation had finally caught up with her. Now she processed insurance claims in a windowless office. Her designer wardrobe long since sold, her savings depleted. Her phone buzzed. Another email from Brian Patterson, still hiding in Mexico. His latest venture had failed, like all the others. His message was familiar, begging for money, blaming her for their downfall, threatening to expose more details about their past schemes if she didn't help. "Delete," she muttered, just as her ancient Honda's check engine light had started flickering that morning. She couldn't afford repairs, not with her credit still ruined from the divorce proceedings. Meanwhile, in Avalon's Chicago headquarters, Rick reviewed the latest acquisition proposals with his executive team. Sandra Martinez, his CTO, had just returned from a successful presentation at MIT. "The quantum computing breakthrough changes everything," Sandra explained, highlighting projected market impacts. "We're 5 years ahead of our closest competitors." Tyler, now 17 and already taking advanced placement courses at Northwestern, sat in on the meeting. Rick had instituted a mentorship program, allowing gifted students to observe executive sessions. His son's aptitude for technology had flourished under Sandra's guidance. The Asian expansion exceeded projections, Lucas Wright noted, now Avalon's chief strategy officer. Madeline's venture capital connections proved invaluable. Madeline Torres smiled slightly. Her investment in Avalon had multiplied 30-fold since backing Rick's takeover. "Speaking of connections, our intelligence division has an interesting report about Brian Patterson," Lucas continued. Rick raised an eyebrow, gesturing for her to continue. "His latest scheme collapsed spectacularly," Madeline explained. "He tried to convince Mexican investors he had proprietary Avalon technology to sell. Detective Martinez's team documented everything." Patricia Blackwood, who'd expanded her role to Global Chief Legal Officer, added her perspective. "We've ensured Mexican authorities are aware of his fraudulent activities. His options for hiding are becoming limited." Rick's methodical destruction of his enemies had become a Harvard Business School case study in strategic corporate warfare. The article, Patient Predator, detailed how he'd systematically dismantled the old regime while building something greater. "Dad," Tyler interrupted, pointing to his tablet. "Brian's trying to scrub his online presence. My algorithmic tracking program caught him deleting social media accounts." Rick allowed himself a small smile. Tyler had inherited his gift for patient strategy combined with a brilliant technical mind. The boy's tracking program had already caught 3 corporate espionage attempts. Sarah Chun, now Rick's chief of staff, entered with more updates. Mrs. Rodriguez called from the charitable foundation. The Science Education Initiative is expanding to 50 more schools. The Maria Rodriguez Foundation for Youth Science Education, generously funded by Avalon, had become Rick's tribute to their loyal former housekeeper after her retirement. She now supervises programs giving opportunities to promising students from underprivileged backgrounds. And Heather? Rick asked, maintaining his tradition of quarterly intelligence reviews on potential threats. Working insurance claims in Milwaukee, Sarah reported her apartment building is being converted to condos. She can't afford the buy-in or moving costs. Her last 3 job applications were rejected after background checks revealed the SEC investigation. The systematic dismantling of Heather's life had become a warning throughout the business world. Her attempts to rebuild had been blocked at every turn by the toxic combination of documented financial misconduct and Rick's quiet influence. Detective Martinez's latest surveillance photos show the toll of 5 years of constant downfall. Heather's expensive cosmetic procedures had been replaced by visible aging. Her power suits had given way to off-the-rack business casual. Her confidence had dried and become a defeated shuffle. Brian hadn't fared better. His Mexican exile had devolved into a series of failed schemes and increasingly desperate attempts to trade on his former Avalon connection. Each attempt was met with legal action, his credibility eroding with every exposure. The Mexican authorities are closing in, Detective Martinez reported. His latest investment fraud caught the attention of their Securities Commission. He's running out of places to hide. Rick's empire had grown far beyond Avalon. Strategic Investments, guided by Madeleine's expertise, had built a technology consortium that reshaped multiple industries. Each success was another twist of the knife for those who'd underestimated him. Catherine Olson's portrait still held its place of honor in the boardroom, but it was now joined by a gallery of innovation awards and patents. Her final letter to Rick had become part of company lore, quoted in business school textbooks studying Avalon's transformation. The next morning, Tyler burst into Rick's home office. "Dad, MIT accepted me into their advanced placement program." Rick examined the acceptance letter with pride. Your son had earned this on merit. No strings pulled, no favors called in. Tyler's brilliance, nurtured in the stable environment Rick had fought to create, had bloomed naturally. We should celebrate, Rick decided. Invite Sandra and the research team. You can share your quantum encryption proposals. That evening, as Tyler presented his ideas to an appreciative audience of technical experts, Rick reflected on the complete victory his patience had earned. He destroyed his enemies not through direct confrontation, but by building something so magnificent that their own mediocrity became their prison. A message from Detective Martinez provided a fitting counterpoint to the celebration. Brian Patterson has been arrested in Cancun, she reported. His latest investment scheme has attracted federal attention. His desperate attempt to trade information about Avalon for leniency has been met with documented proof of his own embezzlement. Heather's response to Brian's arrest made the local Milwaukee news. She'd been recorded having a public breakdown, screaming about conspiracies and revenge in her insurance company's lobby. The video had gone viral, ensuring that any remaining employment prospects would evaporate. Karma, Sandra commented, watching the video clip, is best served systematically. The next week, Rick hosted Avalon's annual Innovation Awards. The company had become a magnet for technical talent, its culture of merit and innovation a stark contrast to the political machinations of Heather's era. Success, Rick told the assembled brilliance, comes from building, not destroying. But sometimes you must clear away the dead wood before new growth can flourish. In Milwaukee, Heather watched the live stream from her efficiency apartment, surrounded by the remnants of her former life. Her phone contained Brian's increasingly unhinged emails from Mexican prison. Her bank account showed a negative balance, and her network of former contacts had long since blocked her number. The final insult came in her mailbox. A Northwestern alumni magazine featuring Rick on the cover. The article detailed Avalon's rise under his leadership, with extensive praise for his strategic brilliance and innovative vision. Her own name appeared only once in a sidebar about failed corporate governance. In his penthouse office, Rick received a quarterly intelligence update. Heather had applied for bankruptcy protection, her debts overwhelming her diminished income. Brian faced extradition for investment fraud, his Mexican hideaway having finally collapsed. Their collective fall from grace was absolute and irreversible. Tyler's quantum encryption protocol has passed initial testing, Sandra reported, changing the subject to more relevant matters. The NSA is interested in licensing discussions. Rick nodded, turning his attention to the future. He'd learned long ago that the sweetest revenge wasn't in watching enemies fall. It was in soaring so high that they became invisible from your elevation. The Maria Rodriguez Foundation had just announced its latest initiative, fully funded technical scholarships for promising students. Tyler had suggested the program, understanding that true legacy came from creating opportunities, not destroying lives. Your mother called again, Sarah mentioned during the morning briefing. Same message as always. Rick's response was the same it had been for 5 years. Silence. Heather's desperate attempts at reconciliation, her pleading messages about family and forgiveness, met the same fate as her career aspirations, systematic rejection. The lesson had become legend in business circles. Cross Rick Kessler, and you don't just lose, you cease to exist in any meaningful way. Your destruction comes not from direct attack, but from the contrast between his ascension and your own inevitable descent. In the end, Rick's revenge had transcended mere punishment. He built an empire on the ashes of betrayal, his success becoming a perpetual reminder to his enemies of everything they'd lost. Their suffering came not from his actions, but from their own insignificance in the wake of his triumph. Tyler's MIT acceptance celebration dinner gathered the loyal inner circle: Sandra, Lucas, Madeline, Patricia, Detective Martinez, and Maria Rodriguez. Each had played their part in the transformation. Each had been rewarded with position and prosperity. As Rick surveyed his assembled family of choice, he reflected on the completeness of his victory. He hadn't just won. He transcended the very battlefield where Heather had fought herself supreme. True power, he discovered, lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to build something so magnificent that your enemies were forced to witness their own irrelevance for the rest of their diminished lives. To the future, he toasted, surrounded by loyalty and success, while his enemies languished in obscurity. That, I knew, was the most exquisite revenge of all.